Snow in Alaska does not simply fall. It accumulates authority. It settles in layers thick enough to erase sound before it forms, burying footsteps, swallowing echoes, muting even the crack of distant branches under frost. The cabin stood alone at the edge of a frozen tree line where black spruce cut sharp silhouettes against a sky that never fully brightened in winter. There were no power lines, no distant roads, no neighboring smoke columns, just white ground stretching outward until it blended into tree shadow. Caleb had chosen this place for isolation, believing isolation was control. A month off-grid in late winter sounded manageable when planned from warmth. The satellite phone was charged, the generator stocked with fuel, the woodpile stacked neatly against the rear wall beneath a reinforced tarp. Food sealed inside metal containers. Every variable calculated. The first 3 days reinforced that belief. Sub-zero temperatures held steady, but predictable. Smoke rose straight up from the chimney in thin gray lines that disappeared into pale sky. The only sounds were his own boots crunching through crusted snow as he checked trap lines along the tree line each morning. The world felt paused rather than hostile. That illusion fractured on the 4th day. One trap was empty without being sprung. The bait gone cleanly. No scattered fur, no broken mechanism, just absence. He crouched slowly, studying the snow surface. Tracks circled the trap in tight loops, compact but wide. Claws pressed deep through crust into softer powder beneath. The stride spacing was deliberate, weight-centered, not erratic like fox, not stretched like wolf. He measured the print with his glove beside it and felt recognition settle. Wolverine. Not large compared to wolves, not towering like bear, but built dense and low with muscle that doesn't waste energy. They are not pack hunters. They don't intimidate through numbers. They dominate through refusal to retreat. Caleb reset the trap and scanned the tree line longer than necessary before returning to the cabin. That night, the first contact came. Not vocal, not dramatic. A slow scrape along the rear wall beneath the window. Claws dragging across wood in measured strokes as if mapping dimensions. Caleb froze mid-step beside the stove, every muscle tightening as the sound traveled from one corner of the structure to the other. No hurried movement, no panicked pacing, just inspection. Then silence. The kind that feels deliberate rather than empty. He waited a full minute before approaching the window and lifting the curtain barely an inch. Moonlight reflected off hardened snow in pale blue sheets. The clearing appeared undisturbed. No visible movement, no silhouette, but snow lies. It conceals depth and absorbs vibration. He stepped outside with a flashlight, beam cutting clean through cold air. The woodpile bore shallow gouges near its base. Fresh. Fibers exposed. He circled the cabin perimeter slowly, scanning for tracks, and found them pressed deep beside the rear wall, closer than before. The animal had not merely passed through. It had stood there, listening, testing. He secured the trash bin with additional rope and checked the sled he kept anchored against the cabin wall. Tight. Stable. He told himself curiosity explained it. Wolverines investigate scent. They move on. By morning, the sled lay 10 feet from where he had secured it, flipped onto its side. Rope chewed clean through with controlled pressure rather than torn apart. The trash bin lid hung crooked despite reinforcement. The woodpile showed deeper gouges carved deliberately into solid timber. This was no random scavenging. It was persistence. The next day, 2 traps vanished entirely, dragged off trail into dense brush. He followed the drag marks cautiously and found the bent metal frames half buried in snow 30 yards from their original positions, mechanisms crushed inward by jaw force. He stood there longer than necessary, breath visible in thin clouds, scanning the trees. The forest remained still, but stillness in winter does not equal emptiness. It equals concealment. That evening, as light thinned to gray rather than true sunset, he heard movement again, this time not scraping but the soft compression of snow under weight circling the cabin slowly. One full rotation, then another. The steps did not rush. They maintained consistent spacing, calculated distance. He loaded the rifle and kept it within arm's reach near the stove, though he knew shooting blindly into dark would accomplish little. Wolverines do not charge loudly. They close distance in patience. At some point in the night, the generator coughed briefly before stabilizing. In the morning, he discovered the fuel line partially chewed near its base, teeth marks embedded in rubber. Not enough to disable it fully. Enough to test vulnerability. The realization settled cold and heavy. The cabin was not simply shelter. It had become a structure under assessment. The Wolverine had identified food scent, warmth, stored resources. It had inspected walls, sled fuel source, trash, traps. It had measured reaction time and distance. And unlike wolves that roam through territory in wide arcs, this animal had narrowed its focus. It was not passing through. It was claiming adjacency. The white silence around the cabin no longer felt peaceful. It felt occupied. The pattern did not break the next day. It intensified. Caleb woke before dawn to a new sound, not scraping this time, but a low, steady thud against the base of the cabin, rhythmic and deliberate, as if something dense was testing structural points rather than wandering. He stayed still in the bunk, counting the intervals between impacts. 3 seconds. Then another thud. Not random, not frantic. Controlled pressure. When he stepped outside at first light, he saw why. One of the lower support beams beneath the cabin platform bore fresh bite marks, carved deep into treated wood, teeth impressions aligned with brutal precision. Wolverines do not gnaw without reason. They test resistance. They learn density. The generator housing showed new scratches across its metal casing. The trash bin had been dragged 5 feet despite additional reinforcement. This was no longer curiosity. This was escalation through repetition. Caleb checked his remaining traps with growing tension. 2 were sprung but empty. One had been dug up entirely and reburied upside down, as if dismantled out of irritation. The tracks around them overlapped in layered circles. Snow packed down hard by repeated passes. The animal had returned multiple times overnight. That meant proximity. That meant watchfulness. As the day dragged under flat gray light, the temperature dropped further, air sharpening into a brittle cold that burned lungs on inhale. Caleb reinforced the generator fuel line with metal shielding and moved remaining food containers higher inside the cabin. He blocked the crawl space opening beneath the porch with scrap lumber. Every action felt reactive rather than preventative. By dusk, the sky never truly darkened, just faded into a deeper shade of steel. He heard it again before he saw evidence. The soft crunch of snow compressing near the woodpile, closer than before. He stepped to the window and saw a shape for the first time. Low, thick, dark against white. Not large in height, but heavy in posture, shoulders rolling with compact muscle as it moved. It did not hurry when the cabin light shifted behind glass. It paused, head turning slightly toward the window. Wolverines do not need to bare teeth to intimidate. Their stillness does that. Caleb raised the rifle slowly, but the animal did not flee. It held eye contact through the glass for a long second, before continuing along the wall, vanishing behind the structure. Minutes later came the scrape again, this time higher, claws dragging along the door itself. The handle rattled once, not forcefully. Testing movement. Caleb felt something colder than the air settle under his ribs. This was no longer about bait or trash. The animal had learned that warmth and scent originated inside. That night, the generator cut out entirely. Silence swallowed the cabin. Caleb grabbed the flashlight and moved toward the back wall where the fuel line ran. The door burst inward at that exact moment, not fully shattered, but forced open inches by sudden weight. Snow sprayed across the floor as the Wolverine lunged halfway into the threshold, jaws snapping at empty air before Caleb slammed the rifle butt against the frame and fired downward. The shot thundered in the confined space. The animal recoiled instantly, not in panic, but in controlled retreat, vanishing into white darkness beyond the doorway. Caleb slammed the door shut and barred it with a heavy beam. His ears rang in the silence that followed. Outside, no frantic escape pattern echoed, no retreating crash through trees, just the faint crunch of repositioning somewhere beyond visibility. The animal had not attacked blindly. It had timed entry with mechanical failure. It had waited for the generator to die. The fuel line outside was severed completely now, chewed clean through. The realization hit harder than the cold. This was no random scavenger. It was a predator, eliminating external variables before committing further. Caleb relit lanterns inside the cabin, knowing artificial light meant little in this terrain. The white silence outside pressed closer than before. And somewhere just beyond the tree line, something compact and relentless was recalculating the next point of pressure. The temperature dropped hard after the generator failed. Without mechanical heat, the cabin began losing warmth, minute by minute. Frost creeping inward along window edges in thin, crystalline veins. Caleb kept the wood stove fed, but wood runs out faster than fuel when you burn it against panic. Outside, the white landscape reflected no movement, no visible threat. That was the worst part. The Wolverine did not circle loudly anymore. It did not scrape. It did not test casually. It disappeared into the silence, and silence in sub-zero terrain is concealment. Caleb moved through the cabin methodically, sealing cracks with spare cloth, repositioning furniture to brace the damaged door, stacking heavy crates against lower panels. He understood something clearly now. The animal was not trying to breach in a frenzy. It was dismantling systems, first traps, then trash, then sled mobility, then fuel line. Now it waited for temperature to do what teeth did not. Night flattened into an endless gray, where the sky never fully darkened, just dimmed. Caleb heard the first interior sound shortly after midnight. Not outside this time, but beneath the floorboards. A dull, grinding pressure against the underside of the cabin platform. He froze mid-step as wood groaned faintly under concentrated weight. The crawl space he had boarded earlier creaked. A low snarl vibrated upward through the planks, not loud, but close enough to feel through boots. The animal had shifted tactics. If the door was reinforced, it would come from beneath. Caleb grabbed the pry bar and moved to the trapdoor hatch leading to the crawlspace access inside the cabin. It shuddered violently as something slammed upward from below. Nails bent. One board cracked clean through. Snow dust filtered upward through widening seams. The Wolverine was digging from underneath, using packed snow as leverage, using structure as weakness. Caleb drove screws through the hatch frame with shaking hands, but the impact came again, harder. Wood splintered. A claw punched partially through the gap, black and curved, raking inward before withdrawing. The animal was not retreating after resistance. It was adjusting angle. Another slam. The hatch bowed upward visibly. Caleb realized the flaw in his reinforcement too late. The platform beams were thick, but the crawl hatch was thinner by design. The next strike split it down the center. The wood gave way in a violent crack, and the Wolverine surged upward into the cabin interior in a blur of dense muscle and snow. It was smaller than a wolf, but heavier than it looked, shoulders rolling forward with explosive intent. Caleb swung the pry bar instinctively, striking its side. The impact landed, but the animal did not hesitate. It lunged low and fast, jaws snapping onto his forearm. The pain was immediate and blinding, teeth crushing through fabric and into flesh with shocking force. Caleb drove the pry bar downward against its skull repeatedly, the confined space amplifying every strike. The Wolverine released and twisted sideways, claws tearing across his thigh in a single ripping motion before launching toward the stove area. It did not flee. It moved to control the space, positioning itself between Caleb and the door. Blood soaked into his sleeve as he stumbled backward, grabbing the rifle. The animal's head turned sharply, eyes fixed not on panic, but on opportunity. Caleb fired at near-contact range. The shot detonated through the cabin, muzzle flash blinding in the dim interior. The bullet struck, but not cleanly enough to drop it instantly. The Wolverine recoiled and slammed into a storage crate, then lunged again with undiminished aggression. Wolverines do not bluff charge. They commit. Caleb fell backward over a chair as claws raked across his jacket again. He fired a second time, this one catching the shoulder joint. The animal convulsed, but still attempted forward movement, snapping at air inches from his throat. Caleb drove the rifle butt into its jaw and rolled aside, reaching blindly for the hatchet near the woodpile. The Wolverine regained footing immediately, despite blood matting its fur. It came again, relentless, low to the ground, and impossibly fast in confined space. Caleb swung the hatchet downward with everything he had left. The blade connected at the base of the skull as the animal lunged. The force of collision knocked them both sideways. For 2 full seconds, the cabin was nothing but breath, blood, and the scrape of claws against plank. Then the movement slowed. The Wolverine's body twitched once, twice, and went still. Silence returned with violent abruptness. Caleb lay on the floor staring at the ceiling beams as frost crept further along the windows. His arm burned. His leg throbbed. Blood pooled dark against wood warmed by the stove. He did not feel triumph, only exhaustion. Outside, the white silence remained unchanged. No howls, no circling pack, just wind brushing snow across a clearing that looked empty. But the cabin was no longer untouched. The crawl space gaped open beneath broken boards. Cold air poured in through the breach. The stove crackled weakly. And Caleb understood one final thing with painful clarity. Isolation does not make territory neutral. It makes it visible to something that refuses to surrender space, once chosen. Caleb did not move for nearly a full minute after the wolverine stopped breathing, not because he feared it would rise again, but because the cold had already begun reclaiming the space the struggle had heated. The broken crawl-space hatch yawned open beneath the cabin floor, pouring sub-zero air into the room in a steady, invisible current that cut through fabric and skin alike. Blood from his forearm soaked into his sleeve and dripped onto the boards in dark, spreading patterns that steamed faintly in the stove's weak warmth. His thigh burned where claws had opened muscle, not deep enough to cripple, but deep enough to slow him. The animal lay twisted near the stove, compact body still dense even in death, jaws slightly parted, teeth bared, not in threat now, but in permanent tension. There was no triumph in the room, no sense of victory, only consequence. Caleb forced himself upright, pressing cloth hard against his arm to slow the bleeding, while dragging a heavy crate over the shattered hatch. The boards groaned under weight, but sealed enough to reduce the worst of the airflow. The temperature inside the cabin had already dropped several degrees. Frost thickened along the window frames and crept inward, like branching veins. The generator line outside was still severed. Without it, heat depended entirely on wood. He calculated what remained stacked against the rear wall and knew it would not last more than 2 nights at the rate the cold was seeping in. He needed distance. He needed signal. He needed to leave before blood loss and temperature combined into something irreversible. He wrapped his arm tight with gauze and tape from the medkit, binding it until his fingers tingled. The thigh wound he packed and secured as best he could, knowing full well infection risk would come later if he survived the immediate threat. He moved deliberately now, every action slower, conserving energy as much as heat. He packed essentials only: satellite phone, remaining ammunition, water, emergency rations, thermal blanket. The sled was damaged, but repairable. He dragged it upright despite the ache in his leg and retied the harness using chain instead of rope. The wolverine's body he left where it fell. There was no time for burial, and no illusion that burial would change anything in terrain like this. Outside, the sky had shifted into pale steel again, wind brushing fine snow across hardened drifts in low serpentine lines. The clearing looked untouched despite what had occurred inside. That was the nature of white silence. It erases narrative. Caleb stepped out, each breath cutting into his lungs like glass. He scanned the tree line once more, not for movement, but for understanding. Wolverines do not roam in packs. This one had chosen adjacency, had dismantled systems patiently, had forced escalation through persistence. Removing it did not remove the lesson. Territory here does not belong to the first to build shelter. It belongs to the one who refuses to retreat. He secured the cabin door behind him not out of habit, but instinct, then hauled the sled forward along the barely visible supply trail. Every step through crusted snow sent pain up his leg, but stopping meant freezing. The satellite phone displayed weak connection, flickering between bars as he moved farther from the cabin's interference. He made the call while walking, voice steady, but thin from cold. Coordinates transmitted through short, clipped sentences. Rescue would not be immediate, hours at least, possibly longer depending on wind and visibility. That meant endurance. He kept moving until the tree line thickened enough to break wind exposure slightly. Blood loss made the world tilt subtly at the edges. He forced focus onto rhythm. Step, pull, breathe. Step, pull, breathe. The white landscape stretched endless and indifferent in all directions. No landmark dramatic enough to suggest safety. At one point he thought he heard movement parallel to him beyond the trees, and his grip tightened on the rifle instinctively. But nothing emerged. It might have been wind collapsing snow from branch weight. It might have been memory replaying pressure, time distorted in cold. Minutes felt like segments carved from bone. When the distant thrum of rotor blades finally reached him, it sounded unreal, like imagination layered over wind. He stepped into the most open section of clearing he could find, and fired one shot into the air, despite the cost of ammunition. The helicopter cut through low cloud minutes later, downdraft scattering snow outward in violent spirals that erased his tracks instantly. Paramedics moved fast, efficient, practiced. They stabilized him where he stood rather than risk collapse mid-transfer. As they lifted off, Caleb looked down once toward the direction of the cabin. From altitude, nothing marked it as contested. Just a small, dark square amid white expanse. No sign of the breach. No visible scar in snow. White silence had already begun sealing over every trace. Weeks later, officials would retrieve what remained of the cabin and document the incident as an aggressive wildlife encounter under resource scarcity. They would measure bite force and structural weakness, write reports about seasonal territorial expansion. They would categorize it. But none of that language would capture the rhythm of those footsteps circling in snow or the deliberate dismantling of fuel and rope before force. Caleb would heal with scars that tightened in cold weather and a deeper understanding that isolation is not absence of threat. It is invitation to something that does not negotiate space. The Alaskan winter does not roar when it corrects intrusion. It waits. It studies warmth leaking through walls. It measures resistance. And when white silence breaks, it does so without warning, without audience, and without needing to claim victory.